Good afternoon, and welcome to the Library of Congress. Thank you all for coming. I'm Sharon Horowitz. I'm a reference librarian in the Hebraic section. I also want to acknowledge the presence of two previous heads of the Hebraic section, Dr. Michael Grunberger and Dr. Peggy Perlstein. We are honored to have you both attending the program. And many thanks to the music division for allowing us to use this beautiful room, which is decorated with historic instruments created by Antonio Stradivari. The systematic development of Hebraica in the National Library began in 1912 when a Jewish philanthropist named Jacob Schiff bought a collection of 10,000 Hebrew books, pamphlets, and manuscripts assembled by book collector Ephraim Dinard and gave them to LC. Today, the section has more than 300,000 books in Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, and other Hebraic script languages. Our work includes selecting books to add to the collection, lending books and sending articles to other institutions via interlibrary loan, responding to requests for information both online and in person from members of Congress, students, professors, as well as the public. And we sponsor programs like this to further our mission to preserve and publicize our collections. This program is made possible through the generous support of the Lilly Endowment. Today's speaker, Dr. Ann Brenner, was formerly my colleague, serving as the Hebraic specialist in the African and Middle Eastern Division from 2009 to 2022. Prior to that, she taught medieval Hebrew poetry at Ben-Gurion University. She has published 2 books in her field and 2 historical novels. She is also an accomplished collager. We are honored that she has come to share her book, which was a National Jewish Book Awards finalist in the visual arts category, and is available for purchase at the gift shop on this floor. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ann Brenner.
Hi. Shalom l'kulam. Sharon, thank you for that very lovely introduction. I'd like to thank Sharon and Dr. Biton for inviting me to speak here today. I'm sorry, I'm just so moved to be here again. It's been such a long time. I'd like also to thank all of you for braving the cold to come to today's lecture to help us celebrate the Hebraic collections here at the Library of Congress. To make it even more festive, we have here with us today, as Sharon's already mentioned, 2 former heads of the Hebraic section, Peggy Perlstein and Michael Grunberger, in addition, of course, to our new head, or I should say our newish head, he probably feels like an old-timer by now, Dr. Yoram Biton. So we have in this room 3 generations of leadership for the wonderful, wonderful Hebraic section of the Library of Congress. So thank you all for coming today. As Sharon mentioned, I began working at the library in 2009. And let me get settled here. Okay. So I began working at the library in 2009. And during my first few years, I lived in a small apartment on Capitol Hill. And every morning when I walked to work, I passed by the Folger Shakespeare Library just across the street. And every morning, there on the front lawn of the Folger stood Puck, straight out of A Midsummer's Night Dream, to greet me on his carved pedestal with the words, "What fools these mortals be." It was a greeting that never failed to make me laugh, though sometimes, when the traffic going past seemed particularly bad, or I didn't quite manage to dodge the early morning sprinklers, or it took longer than usual to pass through library security, I had to admit that old Puck there might just have a point. But then I'd enter the library, and in a second, all of that vanished. Here, everything was harmony and soaring space. the quiet of scholarship and the gleam of marble and gold. And above all, there were books, wonderful Hebrew books, from every corner of the earth, from every time period, from every place. Hebrew books printed at the very dawn of printing, just after Gutenberg and before the expulsions from Spain and Portugal. Books printed in Naples, when Naples was an independent kingdom, and in Venice, when Venice ruled the waves, and in the Ottoman Empire, in the years of Ottoman glory, years when Jews escaping from Spain and Portugal brought with them the treasures of Sephardi culture. There are also extremely rare children's books from the early 20th century. Some of them printed in Moscow and Odessa during the very thick of the 1917 revolution, and so rare they have survived only here in the Library of Congress. There are gorgeous artist books from modern-day Israel. In fact, a collection that surpasses even that of the National Library of Israel. Baroque wedding poems from 18th century Italy. And of course, the library's most famous Hebrew treasure of all, the Washington Haggadah, and so much more. These are only some of the collections with which it was my privilege to work over the years. And thanks to the generosity of the U.S. Congress, new treasures kept coming in year after year, augmenting this important collection of Hebraica here in the heart of our nation's capital. So, 15 years later, when it came time to write Books Like Sapphires, my own book about the Hebrew treasures, new and old, here in the Library of Congress, it wasn't easy choosing which books to include and which ones to leave out. But if you think that was hard, it was as nothing compared to my, frankly, agonized preparation for today's short talk. Books Like Sapphires has 47 chapters, each chapter featuring one, sometimes two special treasures. Here, for example, a unicorn gracing the colophon of one Hebrew book printed in 16th century Poland. There, a King David strumming his harp in the late watches of the night, in a miniature Hebrew manuscript from 18th century Germany. So how do you choose what to include in a single lecture? Well, in the end, you just choose. You just have to. And since Purim is just around the corner, I thought I'd start with the library's illustrated Scroll of Esther, the one generally known as the Washington Scroll of Esther. Now, the Scroll of Esther is the biblical scroll read on the Jewish holiday of Purim, a joyous occasion commemorating the triumph over the enemies of the Jewish people in ancient Persia. It commands the Jews to observe Purim, and I quote, as days of feasting and gladness. It is the one day in the Jewish calendar when merrymaking is not only permitted but actually ordained, and the Washington Scroll of Esther embodies this carnival-like spirit. While we cannot say for certain when or where the Washington Scroll was produced, it appears to come either from Italy or more likely the Netherlands, and published sometime during the 18th century. This would put its creation about a century or so after the first illustrated scrolls of Esther began to appear. Time enough to develop certain artistic conventions in the illustration of the story. But as we will see, the Washington Scroll of Esther has some rather unconventional features as well. One of these is that the scroll presents the story almost like a play, a Purim play, complete with stage curtains, entrances and exits, and musical interludes according to the fashion of the day. Look, for example, at these images on the screen. Here we see theater-like curtains in red framing scenes above and below the text panel, while in the right-hand image at the bottom, even the canopy of trees seems to frame the scene like a curtain. Another theatrical touch is a movement between scenes, so to speak, with open doors supplying the stage entrances and exits. We see this already at the beginning of the play. Look at the very first frame over there on the right. There you have one character entering the king's banquet hall through one open door, there on the far right, while on the other side, somebody else leaves through another door into a different stage setting. There are even musical interludes scattered throughout, just as there would be in real plays during this period. And this one's my favorite. And here is one portion of the scroll that presents all these theater-like elements at one and the same time. In the frames up there at the top, we see the stage curtains, the doors opening like for entrances and exits, and also the musical interludes. It is almost as though we are watching a Purim play in action. And indeed, Purim plays were very much in vogue in both Italy and Holland during the 18th century. In this Purim play, so to speak, our actors walk in and out of their scenes in full costume. Mordecai the Jew is dressed in traditional style in a long garment and a turban, there on the right. Esther, on the other hand, looks like a European princess, dressed in rich brocades and voluminous skirts. The palace guards are also pure 18th century. Indeed, with their breeches, knee socks, and tri-cornered hats, they might have come straight out of the painting of the American Revolution. And King Ahasuerus, the king of Persia, well, the king is dressed as a Chinese mandarin. This is only one of several Chinese touches in the Washington Scroll of Esther, and is undoubtedly a byproduct of the fashion for all things chinois in 18th century Europe. All this mixing of costumes creates, by sheer incongruity, some of that sense of boisterous fun that a Purim spectacle demands. Now, here's something that I only learned after leaving the library and doing research for this book. It turns out that the Washington Scroll of Esther has a sister scroll out there in the world, and this scroll lives in Hamburg, Germany. There can be no doubt that the two scrolls were written and illustrated by the same hand. Like its sister scroll in Washington, the Hamburg Scroll of Esther has elements of chinoiserie and is also constructed as a play, with theater-like curtains surrounding most frames, musical interludes, and actors moving between scenes through open doors. The two scrolls have a number of scenes that are almost identical, and one of them, the one you see on the screen now, may even be unique to these two scrolls. In this scene from the Washington Haggadah, we see a woman who is completely naked except for a crown on her head and a tear on her cheek. I don't know if you all can see the tear, but it's rolling down her cheek. She is being led away by two guards. Their spears very strategically placed. The same scene appears in the Hamburg Scroll, and here you can compare the two scenes side by side. The curators of the Hamburg collection describe the scene as Esther being led away to begin her 12-month ritual of beauty care. But there may be another way to read this scene. Perhaps this is not Esther at all, but Queen Vashti, the wife who refused to come before the king when he summoned her and who got divorced for her pains. Now, considering that Esther is a heroine of the piece, one might think the rabbis of antiquity would take every opportunity to denigrate Vashti and view her fall from grace as a fitting comeuppance for unruly behavior from an unruly woman. But in fact, the Jewish sages of antiquity were surprisingly sympathetic towards Vashti. And in the rabbinic literature going back over the millennia, they applaud Vashti for her refusal and justify it by saying that the king must have summoned her to appear naked before the court. So the figure whom the Hamburg curator has described as Esther, weeping as she is taken to the palace, may in fact be Vashti. I think this would explain both her nakedness and the sympathetic way she is identified and treated here, with a tear on her cheek. If this is, in fact, Vashti, it also becomes easier to understand Mordecai's expression as he watches the woman being taken away. It is as though a light bulb is going off in his head and he's thinking, aha, here's a chance for Esther. So I'll put it to my audience. Who do you think we had there, Esther or Vashti? I'd be curious to hear your opinions. Vashti, huh? Okay, I think so too. Poor Vashti. The Washington Scroll of Esther is such a beautiful scroll, just bursting with color and a naive kind of charm. Only not all of our Hebrew treasures come in Technicolor. Quite a few of them come solely in black and white, and it is this fact, actually, that prompted the title of my book. The phrase, books like sapphires, can of course stand on its own. Our Hebrew books are indeed jewels and great treasures, but there's more to it than that. Books like sapphires is an old phrase in Hebrew literature and was originally coined to refer specifically to beauty in black and white. The phrase goes back to 10th century Andalusia, when southern Spain was ruled by Muslim kings. This was also the backdrop for the golden age of Hebrew poetry, when the greatest Hebrew poets since the Bible were writing their poems in flowering courtyards across southern Spain, Cordoba and Granada, Toledo, Seville. It was in their poetry that the sapphire image for the Hebrew book first sparkled, and it's really a very sophisticated little image. I won't go into detail here. For now, let's just say that it is based on Hebrew wordplays and on a very creative interpretation of a verse from the book of Exodus, one that transforms sapphires from blue to white, the very whitest of white. Just to give you one example of how the poets use this image, here are 2 lines from a poem by Moshe Ibn Ezra, written during this golden age of Hebrew poetry in Muslim Spain. A poem like the radiance of day for whiteness, but covered by ink, the cloak of night. A book like a sapphire, lines chiseled in onyx, black as a pupil against the eyes white. Now, all these metaphors of black and white I learned back at university in Israel, and later duly taught to my own students at Ben Gurion University. But then I came to the Library of Congress and discovered, rather to my amazement, that the phrase books like sapphires lived on, that it didn't disappear with medieval Hebrew poetry. Poets, scholars, rabbis all used the image of sapphires to describe the beauty of the Hebrew book and the play of black and white on the page. So there we are, books like sapphires, or in other words, Hebrew treasures in black and white. Now, these treasures in black and white are not always immediately obvious. In fact, they tend to be quite modest in appearance, even rather ordinary. Certainly that is the case for the book I'd like to highlight now. As you'll be able to see when you go up to the display that Sharon and Yoram very kindly put out for you, you'll be able to see a book it's a very slim book, printed in rather cramped Hebrew letters, all in black and white, and not too beautifully bound, but it turns out to be a treasure indeed and to occupy a very special place in Hebrew literature. This volume is a Hebrew play called Pi Sfarim, the mouth of books. And yes, it's a play about talking books. It was printed in Venice in 1669. And I have to tell you that the first time I took the book from the shelf and opened it, it came to me as a huge surprise. I knew the names and dates of the earliest Hebrew plays, and this one was not on the list. You see, Hebrew drama had a very late start compared to the drama of other nations. By 1669, when this Hebrew play was published, Shakespeare had already come and gone in England, and France and Spain were well into their golden age of drama. There had been one single Hebrew play before this, a comedy written in Mantua, Italy in the middle of the 1500s. But that play was a one-off. It was never printed in its own day and was only rediscovered in the 1960s when an Israeli scholar working in the basement of the National Library in Jerusalem discovered it. So when another Hebrew play was published in Amsterdam in 1673, contemporaries thought it was the first Hebrew play. But in fact, we now know that it was only the third because our play, The Mouth of Books, was printed 4 years before that in 1669. 4 years is 4 years. What all this means is that The Mouth of Books is apparently the second known Hebrew play in existence. Though published in Venice, it was written in Padua, fair Padua, to quote Mr. Shakespeare, nursery of arts. Padua, of course, had long been a center of learning, with thousands of students flocking to its famous university century after century from all over Europe. But Padua was also a magnet for Jewish students, with a famous Academy of Jewish Learning, a yeshiva that attracted young men from all across Italy and from Germany, and even from as far away as Crete, the island of Crete, which had an important Jewish community in those days. And our play, The Mouth of Books, was composed in this yeshiva by one of its very own teachers. This teacher was Isaac Cantarini, a rabbi, poet, and scholar who composed a great many works over his lifetime, mostly sermons and religious tracts. But this play was written when Cantarini was quite young, only 24 or 25 years old, probably not much older than his students. And the script is full of youthful energy and fun. Now, the business of any yeshiva is teaching Talmud. And the occasion for this play, as we read on the title page, was the completion of the course on part of the Talmud, Tractate Chulin, one of the 63 tractates in the Talmud. And the tractate, of course, which is what we call Masechet in English, is a slim volume, and a volume, it's part of a multi-volume set. So there are 63 of these tractates of the Talmud. And they had just finished studying Tractate Chulin. So the play was written for the end of the semester, so to speak.
Now for our second sapphire, that is, our second treasure in black and white. But first, let me ask a question. How many of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof? I'll bet some of you know it by heart. Remember that part when one of the village Jews goes up to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, is there a blessing for the czar?" To which the rabbi answers, "A blessing for the czar? Of course. May God bless and keep the czar far away from us." Generations of theater goers have enjoyed these lines, surely some of the most iconic in the American theater. But in reality, the question would never have been asked, because of course there was a blessing for the Tsar, just as there was a blessing for the Emperor of Austria and the Kaiser of Germany and the President of the United States and every other leader of every other country on planet Earth. That blessing begins with the words, "He who brings salvation to kings," and it has been around for at least the last 400 years. So it is hard to imagine how any Jew living in Tsarist Russia could be oblivious to the existence of this blessing. The real question then was not if there is a blessing for the Tsar, but rather, how do you get around saying it? Now, this may well have been the question confronting the worshippers of a new synagogue in Plotzk, a city in central Poland, which then formed part of the vast Russian Empire. The city of Plotzk had a considerable Jewish community in 1840, the year in which the synagogue was dedicated. Thanks to a program that has come down to us from the dedication ceremony and whose title page we see here on screen, we are able to follow right along with the worshipers there in synagogue that autumn day. Let's put the ceremony in context. In 1840, when the synagogue was dedicated, Russia was ruled by Tsar Nicholas I, and his rule was without doubt one of the darkest periods in the history of Russian Jewry. It was Nicholas who established the hated conscription of young Jewish boys into the Russian army, seizing them from their parents at a very young age and pressing them into military service for 25 years. His rule was punctuated by severe anti-Jewish laws. And this was the Tsar whom the Jews and Pots now had to bless in the dedication ceremony for their new synagogue. So what did they do? They blessed him, of course. Not to do so would only invite trouble. Only they did so in what appears to be rather creative misspelling of the Tsar's name. Twice is the Tsar's name mentioned in the prayers, as you can see circled in the highlighted part of the pages on the screen. Twice is the Tsar mentioned, and twice is his name spelled in a way that changes the name from Nicholas to Michael. Now, in English, the change is all too obvious. You'd never get away with it. But in Hebrew, the ploy works perfectly. It is simply a matter of changing the first letter in the name from a nun to a mem, that is, from Nikolai to Mikolai. That's it, just one single letter. Now, if this had happened once, we might put it down to a simple printing mistake. But it occurs twice in each of the two places where the Tsar's name is mentioned. Was this a way of getting around the blessings they were forced to bestow, saying and unsaying them at one and the same time? The very idea is fascinating. I myself can't think of any other explanation. The Jews certainly knew the name of their Tsar, and it is written correctly enough in other Hebrew sources from the period. Perhaps significantly, the title page of this booklet makes no reference to having been approved by the government censor, and Hebrew books in Russia were required to obtain this approval. One can only hope that this program went the usual way of most ephemera, slipping quietly into oblivion, apart from our copy here in LC, that is, and that our daring misspeller, whoever he was, went unnoticed by the authorities. You know, I introduced the synagogue pamphlet by calling it our second sapphire in today's talk. But actually, and I hope you'll agree with me, that whether they come in richest color or in black and white, our Hebrew books are indeed Sfarim Como Sapirim, books like sapphires, all of them. Thank you.